Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. My name is Charles Schilling, and today joins me one of my favorite MVPs. I don't know if you knew that, Ted, that you're one of my favorite MVPs, Ted Pattison. Long time.
I did not know that.
Yeah, long-time developer, a person from the .NET days. Me and Ted have interacted quite a bit. He actually kind of took this left turn at Albuquerque, went and played with Sharepoint for a while, and now he's back. He's been playing with Power BI, and lately, just been going gung-ho on this Power App stuff. So this session is back on that Power BI thing, and he's going to be talking about the developer platform and giving us a sneak peek and a preview of his sessions. You're doing, what, 3 sessions for us at the Microsoft Business Application Summit next week. Is it 3 or 4? How many do I have you down for?
There's 3 sessions. So one's a general Power BI embedding session. The other is on the it's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Power BI Service API. So a little bit of Power BI embedding, but more of kind of the rounded out story of what can you do with this API. And then there's one talk about Power BI embedding for SharePoint framework Webparts.
Oh, that should be fun.
Yeah, what I wanted to do today is just kind of do a couple of the demos that I have. I guess to some degree, since I'm kind of doing these sessions next week, I wanted to kind of use this as a test bed, use all our attendees as guinea pigs. I hope that's okay. Some of my slides are not finalized. I know as developers, you're okay with that. So anyway, what I was going to do is kind of run through the deck quickly. There's something where I assume that a lot of the people here kind of came and saw our update 3 months ago, or kind of already know, some of the basic fundamentals of Power BI embedding. So I'll speed through those pretty quick so we can kind of get on to some demos. And just, some of this will be the talk that I'm giving for Power BI embedding, but I want to carve out a little time at the end to do 2 other demos that will be in my other sessions, in particular, creating SharePoint framework Webparts that use Power BI embedding. And I also want to show how to create a custom connector that basically allows your Power App to talk to the Power BI service, something you can't do unless you create a custom connector. Okay, so we all know about the Power BI service. That's the thing that you can go to through the browser. It's also something that you can access as a developer, through the API. Now, one of the things going forward is remember that the Power BI service goes by a couple names because of how we've used it historically. So whether I say the Power BI Service API or the Power BI API or the Power BI REST API, generally we're always talking about the same thing. Now, when we use this thing, we can make direct REST calls against it. So I'm going to show a demo over the next hour of just creating a single page application, which is going to use React, and then another one which just uses jQuery, but it's all client-side code. So we're not going to use the .NET API. We're going to use direct REST calls. If you have server-side code, well, you can use this .NET library that basically sits on top of the Power BI Service API's, REST entry points and allows you to kind of work at a higher level. Okay, now, whenever you want to use the Power BI Service API, what's important is that you have to create and register an application with Azure Active Directory. And that's always the case, except for later when I show you when we do it with the SharePoint framework Webparts, the SharePoint Online infrastructure has done something where we don't need to create a new app, but they have this new way to basically call into various APIs. And I'll just kind of wait till we get there. Okay, so what is the big picture of embedding? You have an application, it's web-based. Someone's either, on the browser or they're on a mobile device. So the first thing your application has to do is interact with Azure AD, because you need an access token so you can call into the Power BI Service API. Now, once you get the access token and you call into the Power BI Service API, generally we're after data that we need for embedding. So I want to embed a report. I want to embed a dashboard or a dashboard tile. So I have to figure out how to make the call inside there and how to get back things like the GUID for the report or the GUID for the dashboard. Sometimes you need the GUID for the workspace or the GUID for the data set. But the idea is you get all this data back to the browser. And once you've done that, you also have to include an access token, a couple different kinds of access tokens. But then we use a second API. This is all client-side, the Power BI JavaScript API. And we basically make a simple call past the data, and that does the embedding. And remember that once you go through this whole dance, and you've created this iframe that's directly connected, to one of the data centers, that is serving up the report or the dashboard of the title, all the other pieces drop out, and it's a direct connection, between that user's browser or that user's iPhone and the Power BI service. Okay. Now, let's also differentiate between first-party embedding. So first-party embedding is when you authenticate, but then your code takes on the identity of the current user. Today, we're going to see an example of that when you use the SharePoint framework to do embedding, because you're always on as a particular user, and that user is going to need a Power BI license. There's various ways that you can make it work with free license users. It will always work with Power BI Pro users, but free users can also be accommodated by using one of the Power BI dedicated capacities like Power BI Premium. Now, there's also third-party embedding. First-party embedding is mainly for organizations because they control who has Power BI user accounts. They give everyone an Azure Active Directory user account. With third-party embedding, it's more for commercial applications. So with my users, they're not known to Azure Active Directory. I can't give them Power BI licenses. So we use third-party embedding. So when we talk to Power BI, we're always doing it, under a master user account. So your code basically is going to use a master user account, whether it's your account or, whether you create another one inside here. If I kind of start up with the demos that I'm going to be showing here, let's go ahead and I'm going to move, into our Office 365 Admin Center for my particular demo. Now we go into users, so what we've done here is we've created just a Azure Active Directory, or you could think of it as an Office 365 user group if you'd like. But this particular, account, even if it doesn't map to a real user, has to be configured, with a Power BI Pro license, to work correctly. Okay. Once you've given it a Power BI Pro license, step number 2, let me go into Power BI here. Let me go to the workspace that we're going to be using today, the Biz Summit demos. And if I take this workspace and we go ahead and we kind of look at the members here, you can see that I've taken that account and I've configured it, as the admin. It's not always necessary, but one other nice trick to have up your sleeve, whether it's your account, or this daemon account that doesn't have an associated human being, if you want to, get a greater set of permissions, you can basically say, I want to put this user in a role, and it won't be the global administrator, but there is a Power BI service administrator, basically giving you tenant level permissions with Power BI stuff, but now we're not going to give permissions, beyond what's there for Power BI. Okay. So now you've seen that. Let's go back a couple more slides. And third-party embedding, what happens is that we use one account to talk to the Power BI Service API. Now, in first-party embedding, you just take the user's access token and you throw it to the client. However, with third-party embedding, you don't want to do that. Because if you're throwing this access token back to the client, then all of a sudden some attacker has a very powerful access token, that can basically do anything with the Power BI service, that the master account can do. So instead, we work in terms of embed tokens. You have to make an explicit call in to get an embed token, but the embed token is going to have, a very reduced set of capabilities. Okay. So first party versus third party. First party, you're basically building for an organization using SharePoint Webparts and Power BI embedding to extend something. Third party embedding is more of, you're a ISV and you sell accounting packages and you have customers that connect to your portal and you've given them usernames and passwords, but you want to basically, share reports and dashboards using that. Okay. Now, the next project I'm going to look at, this is a project that's been out for a while. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through this one, but this is a project right here, which, let me get down to my demos here. Is called the Daily Reporter Pro. So what I wanted to do was kind of show an MVC application. So it has server-side code that's going to be calling into the API, the Power BI Service API, the server-side version. And then also we have client-side code that calls to the JavaScript API. Now, let's go ahead and run this right here. So both the browser, and the server-side code, is running locally on my machine. If I open up my good friend Fiddler, my wife just doesn't understand why I love this utility so much. Anyway, I digress. Let's go ahead and, click on reports right here. So what you can see is that my application, is going and calling into the API. So for instance, if I call in groups, and then I have the GUID for the group or the workspace, then we have data sets. What we're able to do, is basically pull back this data from the calls inside there. If I look at the JSON involved here, here's what's coming back every time you call in and get information about a data set. A lot of these properties have showed up, recently, is on-prem gateway required. Some of these things, weren't there a ways back. Okay, now let's keep going through here. And I kind of mentioned I want to kind of get on to some more advanced things. I think I'm going to move through talking about app workspaces, just kind of hit the summary points. And that is that with workspaces, when you're doing third-party embedding, you got to use the master user account. Your master user account has to be configured as the admin. And since you're targeting, either free users, or if you're using third-party embedding, you're targeting users that are completely unknown to Power BI and Azure, you then have to use a dedicated capacity. And that could be done, via Power BI Premium, which you buy through Office 365, or by using the Azure embedded Power BI service, which you would purchase through Azure. Okay. Now, there's this notion of capacities. And the idea of a capacity is that we find a way to pay Microsoft, for the processing cycles and for the memory, instead of having to pay them on a per user basis. Okay, now dedicated capacities are required for third-party embedding. You can't basically use it unless you figure out how to pay Microsoft, when you're reaching these, basically unknown users. Dedicated capacities, are more optional, inside of an organization. And inside of an organization is generally one you want to move a lot of users from the Power BI Pro license to the free license, because they're only reading, they're not doing any authoring. Okay, now, if you buy Power BI Premium, this slide lists the SKUs that have been around for a while. There's 2 more, P3 and P4, that are there now. But these are, the most expensive SKUs, but they also give you, the biggest bang for your buck. And if you have created premiums or capacities, through Office 365 and Power BI Premium, you're going to see them inside of the admin portal. Okay, now, once you've got that all worked out, let me keep going through here just to make sure everyone's aware. I can also go to Azure and do the same thing as I can basically do with Power BI Premium, in the sense that I can basically create a dedicated capacity. Okay, so for instance, if I go to Azure, and I'm not going to do this demo, I'm just going to kind of walk through the slides, and I create an instance of the Power BI embedded service, and note that there is a new version, not the older version of a very similar name that was retired. You can now, choose your pricing tier. Now, of course, what's really great about using Azure and the Power BI embedded service that you can't do with Power BI Premium is you can't start it up, run it for an hour, and then shut it down and go to sleep, come back. So you can basically start and stop the service. $750 a month comes down to about $1 an hour. So once again, for $10, I can basically start the service and kind of do my testing for a couple hours. Okay. Now, if you use Power BI embedded service from Azure, instead of using Office 365 and Power BI Premium, you're still going to get a capacity, for each one of those services that you create. You kind of see that, here's one that is also paused. So if I'm a cheap guy, and Chuck can verify that. I'm going to be stopping, my service, whenever I can.
Exceptionally cheap.
Okay, exceptionally cheap. Thanks very much. Now, just to kind of finish up here, let's say that, you're deciding between getting Power BI Premium, which P1 SKU, which basically lets you do everything. There's another SKU called EM, Power BI Premium, and that doesn't allow users to use the Power BI service, browser-based experience, or the mobile devices. So basically, if you're working with EM, you can just do things like SharePoint embedding. So the example of SharePoint embedding, if that's all you were doing, you might be able to save some money, by getting the Power BI Premium EM SKUs. And then you have the Azure SKUs. So remember, as you go down this chart right here, which one can you use to embed content in applications? All of them. Share content with free users, outside of PowerBI.com. And A SKUs, you can't do that because you can't see, who the licensed user is. It basically just runs anonymously. Okay, can you share content with people inside of PowerBI.com? What that really means is, can I go to app.powerbi.com and use the browser? And only the P SKUs do that. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick general chart inside there. Now, I'm going to move ahead a couple slides here. Sorry, I'm just kind of jumping around slides, but we're going to talk about creating Azure applications. So there's a couple different types of applications that you might be creating. And I just kind of wanted to show you, the different types inside here. So let me go ahead and I'm going to move over to Azure. And I'm now working in Azure Active Directory. And within the context of my tenant, I'm going to go to app registrations. And as I go to app registrations and we now look at all apps, here's a whole bunch of demos that I want to show you, and some are set up, as web applications. Some are set up as native applications inside there. So let's look at Daily Reporter Pro. So here's a case right here where when you create these applications and I go to settings, since it's a web app, it has to have a redirect URL. If I go back here and we kind of take a look at this application inside here, let me see if I can get my Solution Explorer back here. And once I get my Solution Explorer back, where is my property sheet? So what you see here is that during development, I'm using this URL. So basically, that's the URL that you register when you're doing development inside there. Secondly, if you have a server-side application, generally you can keep secrets, which means that inside of the web.config file, you have the client ID, and the client ID kind of matches up to, it's also known as the application ID inside there. But then for more secure applications that can carry a secret, for instance, they can have a secret because there's a web.config file and we're not pushing any values back to the client. So if I look down here and I just recognize that I have a senior moment here. I need to take a mulligan, Chuck, and step back 60 seconds. This application is doing third-party embedding. So this is not using a web app. Instead, it uses a native app. Okay, so what you need to do to make this work is that you need the client ID. Okay, in many applications that use Azure Active Directory, you're going to have keys. This one, isn't as secure, unfortunately, because of the way that it authenticates. But because it's a native app, and if I go ahead and we kind of take a look down here, inside, where we're getting the access token, you can see that we're using a user password credential from the Azure Active Directory authentication library. So to use this, first of all, you have to use a native app. It's not supported with web apps, so it's kind of a legacy model. The good news is that by this fall, Power BI will kind of move beyond this and give you a better way to authenticate with an app and identity. But today that's not quite supported. So we create native apps. Note that when you do this direct login side, you're basically just passing the username and password. So for this application, we have the username and password just kind of built into the application. Okay, so Chuck and the Microsoft Corporation strongly recommend that you do not put passwords, inside of web.config files, but instead uses something like the Azure Vault service, to have a better way to keep secrets inside. Okay, but you basically can see how that works. Let's look at a different application. So what I want to do now is let's go ahead and move over. And so here I have a Visual Studio application, but it is entirely client side. So if we look at this application, which I've written in TypeScript largely, I've created a couple different services. Here's the Power BI service. And notice that, I have methods like get reports, but you can see that there's just a workspace ID. Now, how do we authenticate? There is this library that Microsoft has, which is called ADAL.js, the Active Directory Authentication Library for JavaScript. So this is what we're going to use. Now, let me kind of show you the experience right here. So I'm going to start this up. I've tried to kind of keep this pretty simple. But when I click on this button right here, what's going to happen is that I have this little service right here. And this kind of low-level code, is how we can authenticate, using ADAL.js. Okay. And kind of the short story here is that, once we connect, we're able to now connect inside there. There's no server-side code here, but now I want to make calls across the network. So once again, we're just kind of using jQuery in this first demo to call across the network. When I call across the network, hey, there is a dashboard. There are the different reports. So this application, has hard-coded the app workspace inside there. But now what I'm able to do, is click on one of these and kind of see the embedding inside there. Okay, so while I'm not, looking at the client-side code yet, just the whole idea of being able to authenticate using a single-page application and using Active Directory Authentication Library.js, can be pretty useful. One important tidbit here is that when you use applications that are all client-side and they either use the Active Directory Authentication Library for JavaScript or the new one, the Microsoft Authentication Library for JavaScript, we have to support the implicit flow. And what I mean by that is if I click on this application and then I go into manifest, there is this one property that by default will be set to false. And so the idea with the implicit flow is that we're lowering the security because we're taking the access token and we're passing it, right back to the application as a URL. If we pass the access token, back through the browser, it's not as secure. If I want to kind of see if, can we, really demo that, let me go ahead and log out here, and then after logging out, let's bring up my good buddy Fiddler. My wife keeps asking, what's this thing Fiddler you keep getting email messages from? So it's just a tool, Mom, just a tool. Okay, anyway, let's go ahead and log in right here. And what I want you to see is that, after we go through the login process, it basically posts back to the site right here. And, as I come here, and I take a look, some of the things that we can see, is that the, access token, is being passed back inside there. Okay, so you can kind of see the cookies are, coming right back. If I go to web forms and response type inside there. Okay, so, once again, using the implicit flow and building entirely client-side applications, if you know how to talk to the Power BI Service API, you can do what you want. Now, because many of us in the developer world are being ripped away from Visual Studio and pushed into Node.js and Visual Studio Code, or maybe you've gone there voluntarily, let's go ahead and switch over And so another demo that I want to show is going to be a React application. So if I go down to Power BI Embed React demo, let's go ahead and open this one up right here. So once again, this is an entirely client-side application. I've kind of built it with React inside here. For instance, if I go kind of take a look at my components, I have my app, my banner, my left navigation. I have TSX files, to create the view inside there. Let's do it npm and run and then start. So as I run this inside here, once again, this is just created with the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. And the idea is that, as the user clicks your sign in button, okay, and it caches, logs in. So let me go ahead and kind of sign in one more time. But here you're kind of seeing that, it's taking the user through the login experience. And then same thing, it's using implicit flow, to basically push the access token that we need to the back end. And then all of a sudden, I can basically start creating, embedded reports inside here. Let's go ahead and kind of look at some of these other reports. I really like the guys at Power BI Tips. So here's, let's kind of take a look at, one of their, reports that we can embed inside there. Okay. Now, if I take a look at this, note that I built, just like that last example, TypeScript components, that one allows us to, basically call into Azure Active Directory and get access tokens. There's another service that I built as a TypeScript class, that has things like the app workspace ID, and basically gives me the ability to, call into the API and get the data back inside there. Okay, now let's go a little bit further here. So I wanted to kind of go through and talk about permissions. Note that if I go back to Azure, inside here, and if I take one of my applications, and for various reasons, I have to do this with a web app. Okay, that jumped by too fast. But note that if you create a web app, because that can keep server-side secrets and it has a more secure way to authenticate, they allow you to use application permissions or delegated permissions. When you have a native app, what you'll find is they don't allow you to use application permissions because you're not a confidential client, you're a public client. Everything that you have is kind of assumed to be on the client side. You have no secrets, so you can authenticate as a user, but you can't authenticate with an app-only identity. Okay, that was a long explanation, but now if I go back to, one of our applications right here, which is a web app, and I click on settings, we click on permissions, and note that here is the Power BI Service API. So note that currently we have a lot of delegated permissions, which means that your code authenticates as a certain user. And then once it does, it has the user's permissions, as long as the user kind of grants you those permissions. What we'll have over the next few months is the ability to authenticate against the Power BI Service API with an app-only identity. So we won't have a user context, and you can kind of see that there's a small number of properties up there right now, or permissions, but soon we'll have that story. So we'll be able to kind of get rid of the, less secure story today, where third-party embedding requires that we just send a username and password, from the middle tier to authenticate in, with a user identity. So it just makes a lot more sense. Okay, now let me go ahead and since we're in Visual Studio Code right here, let's go ahead and step through, how things work with SharePoint Framework Webparts. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close this editor right here, and I'm going to close the whole folder. And now I'm going to open a different folder. Now, if I go to Power BI Embedding and Demos, So here's the CPT, PBI, SPFX Webparts. It's a long enough name. Let's go ahead and open that right here. Now here, I've created SharePoint Framework Webparts. But I'm not just taking all the code and putting it behind the web part. So like those other examples, it makes sense to kind of split your code out. So I have some services, that are going to be the ones that are calling into Power BI. And this demo and the other demos, since we're using TypeScript, instead of just kind of passing data back and forth freely, it makes sense to kind of model the data that we need. So if I need data about a workspace, it's the ID and the name. If I need data about a report, well, it's the ID, the embed URL, and so on. Now, if we go over and we take a look at the Power BI Service API, here's where things get to be very interesting. So SharePoint Framework, just over the last month, has introduced a new facility so developers can call to other services, such as the Power BI Service API. So you're going to go through this object, which is called the AAD for Azure Active Directory Httpclient. Now, the way things are going to work is that we're not going to create a new Azure application. The SharePoint framework is kind of taking care of things. It already has an application, so it can call in. So it's kind of like we call into this place in the SharePoint framework, and it forwards the call for us. Now, if I go into the config folder inside here, and we go and we look at the package solution, what you're going to see is that there are these web permission requests. So the idea is when I install this solution into SharePoint, it's going to read this and see that my code, wants to make calls inside there. Now, let's go back here. And so at this point, I want to go up to SharePoint. And inside of SharePoint, I'm going to go to the app catalog. Now, with a SharePoint framework component, what I'm able to do with my project, I've already done this, is to run a command, which is gulp bundle -- ship. And then you run a second command. Chuck, are you writing this down? Gulp. And it is package solution. So in short, what happens is that if I go inside here and now I look for, that's the wrong one, it's this one, and there is the SharePoint demo. What you're going to see is that you're going to build, these packages. And then with that package, you can go ahead and install it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select this. And now that I've selected it, I'm just going to redeploy so you can see something interesting. And that is when I deploy this, it will look and see, hey, wait a second, this thing wants to do something special. It wants to use that AAD HTTP client and call in. So as you add this inside here, what we now have to do is we have to go to the SharePoint Admin Center. Okay, if that's not enough, your tenant has to be put in preview mode, and then you have to click the try preview button. But what you're going to see is that there's a new API management. And so now what you'll see is that I've already done this part and I've already kind of granted the permissions. So this UI is not very together. It basically is asking me, to either approve or request, the same permissions that have already been requested. And you also can't, bulk approve or delete these things inside here. So this UI is going to be improved over time. But the main thing is that now I've got this permission granted by the SharePoint tenant administrator. Note that currently, it's not just my project that can call to the Power BI service, but basically there's a switch that allows every single web part in our tenant to call inside there. Whether they're able to make that more granular over time, so project 1 can do this, but project 2 can't, that remains to be seen. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and see what kind of the experience is going to be like. So we'll go back to a SharePoint site. And since this is a SharePoint Framework web part, let's go ahead and say add a page, so we can add one of the modern pages inside here. And so, I'll call this, Ted's page one, something incredibly original like that. And then down here, here are my web parts. Okay. So I have 4 different web parts that we're going to look at here. If I look at the first web part inside here, so let's go down and under source, there's models, services, and then web parts. So if I wanted to do, something very simple right here, and we kind of take a look at these parts inside here, basically there's a workspace ID and a report ID. And when we click on render, I'm calling to the Power BI service to get the report. And this is my method that I've created, inside of my service up here. So the idea is that when someone calls, one of these methods like get report, well, I'm able to make the call, and look how we make the call. So basically there is this AAD HTTP client. Now, the way that I created this 3 weeks ago is already deprecated. They just came out with like some new way that there is a class factory you'll call create on it. Code still works fine, but just think about the concept. And that is, you have this client object that can do HTTP requests, but it's going to just get the access token and attach it to the authorization header, without you having to, worry about that. Just automatically going to work. Okay, now let's go ahead and take one of my web parts. For instance, we'll take the React web part and we'll add this inside here. Okay, now if you're creating React web parts, you have to kind of come to terms with this schizophrenia where there are 2 different classes. There is both the web part class, so let's say that I now go down and we kind of take a look at this React report. And there is the web part class. Let me go ahead and open that up. But then there is also the component, which is the React component. Okay, now let's go ahead and kind of see what this is going to look like. So what I wanted to do here is when we open this up, I wanted to kind of have a nice load indicator telling people, hey, we're calling out to the Power BI service. So that first call calls in as the current user and fills the workspaces. Okay, there are the workspaces I have right here. Let's pick one of those workspaces. When I do that, it has to make another call out to find what are the reports, inside of that workspace right there. And now that we do that, now we could basically add anything to our web part. So if we wanted to do things, like get rid of navigation or, add other parts, that we can do in the client-side coding, that's acceptable. One of the things that I found, Power BI is really good, with keeping your dimensions. If you have something that is, something like a 16 by 9 from width to height, it kind of stays that way in Power BI. In SharePoint, everything slaps up to the top, so you don't automatically get things. So there's a little code I have here, which is just running a little JavaScript behind the scenes. So we're basically doing the width to height percentage, as opposed to putting in an actual height. Okay. Now, you've seen that inside there, and you might say that, well, SharePoint comes with a report web part. Why do I need my own? Well, remember the report web part doesn't let you look through, the app workspaces and pick a report. You have to go to the report and find the URL. One other reason, is that maybe it's not so much a report, but you want to embed one of the other objects. So if I come back here and I say, well, let's go ahead and do a dashboard, we can basically kind of get the same effect where I can now, have the user, pick what workspace, what dashboard, and then kind of have the dashboard lighting up inside here. Okay. Now, this is a code that I guess I haven't posted yet. I'm going to post it for the conference next week. Any of you, that post, into the chat and just give me an email address, I can send you the code if that's something that you want, before next week inside there. Okay. Now, what I wanted to do is just kind of have a walkthrough to kind of show what's possible, as you're building these web parts. One of the things that I found, interesting is that you have two components. You have the class that is the web part, and then you have the class, that is the React component behind that particular web part. And the React component does the UI, but it doesn't know how to do persistent properties. The underlying web part class is the one that, does the persistent properties. So here you can kind of see that we have the underlying class, and we have properties of workspace ID, report ID, and width to height inside there. Also, this kind of shows this technique, where you want to, fill up a combo box inside there. And what I mean by that is, you go ahead and you change this inside, and then you want the next thing, to be loaded down below. So this also shows, the example of, let me go ahead and there is a couple different functions on property pane configuration start, is an important one here. And the idea is that every time you open the configuration pane, we're going to see, has the workspaces been fetched? Yes or no? If both of these are done, return. If not, so this kind of does a lazy loading scheme of things that are inside there, and then it also kind of sets the state in the React component, so the React component sees that, things have changed inside there. Okay. So now you've kind of seen this particular web part. And, one of the things I motivated this through was kind of understanding, how we put together the Azure Active Directory authentication. What I want to do now is let's look at the Power BI Service API, and we're not going to use embedding, but how can I call that from Power Apps? So Power Apps has this idea of standard connectors. And if there is a standard connector to Azure SQL Server or to an Excel workbook or something, you can get there. But quite often there's an API that you can call as a developer, but there's no standard connector. So let's go ahead and I'm now going to move into Power Apps. And, let's look at a simple demo and then a more complicated demo that calls the Power BI Service API. So inside of Power Apps, if I'm in the home page and I go to data and then I drop down to custom connectors, well, I've got two custom connectors. Now, for the first one, let me show you this API. If I go to this URL, which is Subliminal Systems, and that is a domain that I registered, I think it was 1998 for no good reason, but I like it. But now I kind of put a simple web service behind it. So here's a situation where I have a simple OData web service, and I want to be able to, read, lists, do queries and stuff inside. Okay, so in order to make this one work, let's go back here, into Power Apps, and let's go ahead and go into edit mode. So when you create one of these, you basically point to a host, and what is the base URL. Now, the first one, we're not going to do security yet. We'll do security in the second one because that's, one of the tricky parts. But because this is a web service that's just exposed via anonymous access, you can ignore security. And then when it comes to the definitions, you're going to be creating actions, which is basically relate to web service operations. So here's a case right here. I want to call get customers. And the idea is you're able to import a sample. And then also you're kind of able to, look at the response. Okay. So the long and short of it is that you can create a custom connector, and then you can create a connection from that custom connector. And now I can make, calls across the network. Here you can go ahead and see that we are, able to test those inside here. If I take, a particular customer and we go ahead, and run this right here, you can see we're getting data back. Okay, so let's take that same idea, but now let's kind of work with the Power BI Service API instead. Okay, so here, the host is api.powerbi.com, and the base URL is /v1 my.org. Now, when it comes to security, here is where we're going to use, OAuth 2.0. Now, when we use OAuth 2.0, we're going to set up an authentication flow, that's automatically going to be, executed by this custom connector when we want to connect to the service API. So what we have to do, once again, is kind of go back here into Azure Active Directory. Let's go ahead and, look at our applications. And, here is the Power BI custom connector. So first of all, you create it as a web API. Okay. Now you have to take the application ID. And once you get the application ID, let's get back here, and we're basically going to drop that inside there. Then you need a client secret. So the idea of the client secret is that back here in my Azure Active Directory application, there are keys. And the idea of a key is that it is a secret. Think of it as a password, that's shared by your application and Azure Active Directory, so they can authenticate each other and pass encrypted communications back and forth. So if I need a key, I can simply type in the name for what the key is going to be, set a duration, and hit save. Now, you need a key to be able to communicate, but you can have multiple keys. So all you need, is the value of one.
Into a embedded Power BI application. There's a lot of caveats around security. Were you going to demo that today?
Power App into, I wasn't going to demo it.
Okay. All right. So the big issue there is what security context are you bringing to Power BI? Because you are not going to actually force or do a query string into your Power App. So I'm still not seeing your screen, but I did want to let the people know that, putting like what you've just done with SharePoint and putting a Power App into your embedded Power BI report does work. You just need to make sure and put those people into that Office 365 group, so that way the security context flows all the way through and they have access to the Power BI data.
You see my screen yet?
No.
It says I'm sharing. Let me stop. I click the stop sharing button and start one more time.
Okay.
Let's see if that is better. Tell me if you see a purple screen.
Not yet. And then also a couple people mentioned that you haven't called out specifically what's new for the July updates.
Are you able to pull up that one little sheet of paper that you had?
I closed it, but I can certainly read it. So guys, if you haven't actually looked at the release notes, we actually announced this ahead of time. But while Ted's getting sharing working, and it's still not working, by the way, Ted. Some of the new things we talked about in the release notes, and we actually are planning on releasing still. I know July is kind of late, but we're holding those releases for the Microsoft Business Insight Summit. But the ability to set a slicer through the JavaScript API. So Ted was just showing you through how to do all client script applications, and you did not have access to actually control that slicer in the next build, in the next release. You actually do. So that's what's new for the July update. The ability to actually use embedded themes and set themes in your embedded applications. Huge request. And yes, you were going to be able to do that. They've also gone ahead for number 3 is gone ahead and added an interactive feature showcase in the Power BI embedded playground tool.
I keep trying to share. It's telling me it's sharing. You are screen sharing. Okay,
so maybe it's a problem on my side. So let's actually go ahead and so that's the July updates, everybody. I see you noticed that you've pinged me a couple times about that. Can I get somebody to actually act whether or not you can see Ted? I think I'm seeing me at this point. Let me turn off my camera. And see if that helps. So stand by. Ashok, Richard Vanderpool, Dan English, can one of you go out and say whether or not you can or cannot see? Maybe the chat window isn't even working. We're gonna hold tough for just a second.
Okay. I'm not sure if I should refresh the browser or I lose my session.
Yeah, at least as me as a presenter, I'll stick around. But Alan Jones says he sees me. He does not see you, Ted. We're just see Power BI logo now. Only the logo. Only the logo.
I think I probably just need to refresh my session. Okay, I might disappear for a second. I'm come.
Okay, no worries. So everybody, hold tough for a second. Ted's actually going to refresh his machine, so he just dropped off. He's now back. Asha can see Chuck. Oh, hey, we see Ted's machine. Yay! Okay. We actually see application permissions. We actually see the Azure portal with the web security.
Okay. So what I was trying to step through here is kind of the process of you create the new application. You get an application ID. You have to create a key, and you got to take the key value, and we're going to basically paste that inside there. Now you need also the string that identifies the Power BI Service API, as a resource. So when you want an access token, you say, here's the thing I want the access token for. You need that string. And then the idea is that you have to create the connector, and then it tells you what the redirect URL is going to be. Because you have to create it. Notice that this one has kind of North America. So there's something about when you create it, it puts you in a particular data center. And then, after you've done that, after you have created it and you know what the reply URL is, I can come back here and basically tweak the reply URL. Now, also, I give it, whatever particular permissions that we need inside here. Okay, now that's the first part, is basically getting the security working inside there. Next, we have the definitions. So let's kind of start with get workspaces inside here. Also, as I demo this, let me bring up a sample application that is going to use it inside here. So I basically built a small little app on top of this. So the idea is that I have my iPhone, and some users are saying this data is not, in sync. We added more data this morning. We're not seeing that in our reports. So kind of the use case is I want to jump inside here and kind of see all the different data sets. When I have a data set, I want to kind of see, when the data set, has been refreshed. If we go back here and, inside of Power BI, note that I can go to this particular workspace. I can go to a data set, and I can basically do a refresh now. Okay, so the idea is that there's different types of refresh. There is the one that you click in the UI. There is the one that you schedule, and then there's the one that you do via code. Now, so if we go back here and kind of take a look at, what are we seeing at this point? If I now, let's go back here, and all of a sudden, you can see that we have a second one. Okay, can I click a button here? And I have one thing to fix here. It's not in the call itself. It's dealing with the response that's coming back inside here. But now if we go back here, we can see that, I have actually, done the refresh, programmatically, just from my iPhone with this little Power app inside here. So the real magic here is that, when you are creating the custom connector, well, I have things like get workspace. And you can see that get workspace, doesn't require any URL. Well, once I pick the workspace, and now it's time to get the data sets inside there. Well, now what you can see is that I have my orgs groups, and in curly braces, I have the workspace ID. And then you have data sets on the other side. So the idea is that when you create a custom connector, you can put placeholders inside there. Now, if I go back to this app, and let's go ahead and drill into the edit mode inside here. And so what I want you to see here is that I have a couple different screens. So inside of my first screen, what you can see here is if I go and click on this gallery, I'm just calling Power BI connector get workspaces. Now, there's this issue where when you make this call, it doesn't return just a top level array. It returns a property called value, and then value has the array inside there. But now this will bring back a tabular set of data inside here, which makes it now possible, for you. If I go back here and we take a look, we have this custom connector, but now, what are the different things inside? So if I wanted to, not just show the workspace name, but we also wanted to show the ID, we'd be able to do that. Okay, now the next thing we need to get to, is the data sets screen. So in our case right here, if we take a look at the data sets screen and this particular gallery, we can now go back and kind of take a look at the workspace ID, which is kind of set by the previous page. And then as this kind of goes back, one more screen, into the data screen inside here, at this point, once again, we have the get data set refresh. So the idea is that you're able to, let me find it, sorry. In here, I've defined the operations I need. I need to be able to call workspaces to get all the workspaces. Then once we have a workspace, we know what the workspace ID is, and now I can get the data sets inside there. Once we have, gotten that, we want to get the data set refresh history. And this time it's something where you have workspace ID and you have data set ID. So these are just kind of placeholders that are in these calls, but you can kind of see, how they translate, going back here, when I'm trying to fill this, you can see that I call a method and I'm passing those two things inside there. And this function call, just translates, into a call, that parses that GUID for the workspace and the GUID for the data set, into the URL to make the call coming back inside there. Okay. At this point, Chuck, I think I've kind of demonstrated what I wanted to. I think I'm also kind of running out of time here. So if I kind of hand back to you.
Yeah, I wish we'd spent more time on that. That's very, very cool. And you're doing a session on just that connector back into Power BI, or how can we see more of just that connector using Power Apps to go out and interrogate and use the admin functionality and the REST APIs for Power BI?
So next week, the session I have is called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Power BI Service API. So it's kind of a general session, but I'm going to have the demo tightened up a lot more. And then this code will, also be in a GitHub repository.
At that point. Okay. Well. So guys on the call, make sure and watch Hitchhiker's Guide to the Power BI REST API. I know I'm going to go out and take a look at it. It's going to be available on YouTube, and we are going to make all these sessions available after the fact. So I definitely want to see more about this. I want to grab that Swagger file that you've generated here and start playing with this, because this is going to be far easier than my C# code that I keep beating my head against the wall when I actually do this. So once again, guys, I want to thank you. I want to apologize for the behalf of Google on the interruptions. And I'm looking forward to actually next week, where we'll see a lot of you through YouTube that are being recorded through the channels. Otherwise, Ted, I'll see you on Sunday.
That sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.